Okay, and Mrs. Spellman, I just want to say before we get started that this is a project for the Georgetown Public Library, and it'll be part of their oral history about the integration years. Can you say when you moved here?
We moved here in August of 1960,
Okay.
and we had already built our house. Norman had come down before we moved here from Dallas. He was teaching at SMU.
Great. Okay, so you moved here in 1960, and then when did you get involved with the CBS?
Well, I guess right from the beginning. I was on a committee to inspect the facilities at Carver.
Right, and who else was on that committee?
Our next door neighbor, Jay Wolf, and Bob Brown, who's physics professor, and there was a young woman named Billy somebody that lived up on Hutto Road, and her husband taught here, but they,
And on that committee, were there also some other people from the Georgetown school?
Well, Bill Locke was on the committee.
Lott, okay.
And let's see, who else was on there? And I mentioned Bob Brown.
And Jay Wolf.
And Miss Billy somebody. Yeah, Jay Wolf.
Okay.
And, I don't know, there weren't too many of us, really. I think that Billy and I were the only two women.
Okay, and how did you get involved on that board, or on that committee?
I was, active in the PTA. A couple of years later, I became PTA program chairman and then PTA president. As you do when your kids are at school. Mark, our oldest, was in second grade when we moved here.
Okay. And so then from the committee, how did that evolve into you becoming involved with the communities for better schools?
Well, that was what it was for in the first place. We first met at Dr. Eb Gervin's house in his backyard. It was nice weather, and we just all sat out there, and there were a lot of people there. And you've seen a lot of those names, like Wendell Osborne, and I'm not even sure how many. Oh, I have to refer to this. And none of us thought it was worth it for them to build separate schooling for the black kids. Now, when my committee went over to look at Carver, it was in terrible shape. There were big old cracks in the floor, and the classrooms were little bitty, and they didn't have much of a library.
Right.
So, it was over there on the ridge. And so some of us thought it was just absolutely useless, and of course the people on the school board, well, the ones who believed in segregation, wanted to build a separate school for the blacks. And really, we didn't have the money even to do a good job of the Georgetown schools. So it was a financial thing, I think. And let's see. My wonderful minutes here. This is where I name all these people.
Oh, and you kept the minutes.
Yeah, these were submitted by me. And we had several ministers. We had the first big meeting with a number of the black people in the basement of First Methodist Church. It wasn't United Methodist then.
Right.
And
Dr. Spellman was telling me about that. What was that first meeting like?
Well, the black people, of course, asked us why we wanted to do it. And we just said that we thought it was reasonable for everybody to go to the same school, and that the community couldn't afford to build a separate school, and the facilities would never be equal. That just wasn't possible. I'm just looking at the people here. A lot of these school board members had been elected on a platform of keeping segregation. I don't remember if Doug Benold was on the school board at that time. He was never in favor of segregation. And he was one of the people that gave us a lot of money to help bring this suit. We all did. And Norman and other people phoned a lot of people and asked for money. And a lot of university members did. Contributed.
Really? Yeah, so what were your fundraising efforts like? How much time did you devote to...
We didn't vote any in our meetings. The people just did it individually.
Oh, really?
And, I guess Norman went to see some people and called a lot of people, and he was so active, of course, at Southwestern.
And do you remember at that first meeting, was that when you decided what the primary goals should be of Communities for Better Schools?
Yeah, I think it was the primary goal really was that we should have one school system for everybody. Mm-hmm. You know, at the beginning, as you know, there had been a separate one even for the Hispanics, and after they were integrated. But, yeah, and Reverend Richard Smith was the preacher at First Methodist Church then, and he was very much with us. And we had this Reverend James Van Vleck was the minister of the Presbyterian Church, and we elected him chairman, but his church asked him to resign from that position and from the committee. So, of course, he did.
Yeah, it sounds like there was some pressure.
There was a lot of pressure, and there are a lot of people in this community who really thought we were just wild hair. What can I say? You know, and even later when our daughters went to college, you know, there were some sororities that would never have pledged them. Neither one of our girls was particularly interested in the sororities. But, you know, I was never asked to become a member of the Woman's Club in Georgetown, which was very prestigious. Mm-hmm. And that was, I'm sure this would be why.
Yeah, because even though you were so involved with PTA.
Some of our friends who moved to Georgetown 5 years later, you know, I remember the Campbells. He taught English. Mm-hmm. And she was invited to join the Women's Club, but it was too late. They were just as integration-minded as we would have been.
Yeah, and when did that tide sort of start to turn for integration once it happened?
Well, I don't know. Our children never had any problem with it. Mm-hmm. And I remember there was a black student who was in school with our son, who was the smartest kid in the school system at that time. You know, he had really, really big high IQ. And I don't know, you know, whatever happened to him, but I don't have his name here. Well, it's not.
Well, okay, so I'm sorry, kind of jumping all over, but when did CBS decide to pursue legal action to try to get integration?
Yeah, I think pretty early. Mm-hmm. You know, and of course we hired a lawyer, and let's see, I'm just looking at this. Yeah, these are all the people, yeah, who were involved in the Committee for Better Schools. That's a lot of people. You know, the Southwestern people. Of course, the Southwestern people, their jobs were secure. Mm-hmm. And people like Harvey Miller, who's the suit was brought in his daughter's name, Crystal Ann. He worked for the West Van Homes, you know, belonging to the Methodist Church. And there was another one here, Mr. Brown, who was the cook at Southwestern in the dormitory.
Yeah, and didn't Mr. Miller also work at L&M?
Yes. Yeah. That is where he worked. Come to think of you, as you say that, I think you're absolutely right. And let's see, Will Kelly McLean, who was former district attorney here, he and his wife were very much with us. And of course, Gilbert Conley, the county superintendent of schools, he and his wife were very much in favor of it. You know, those people.
Wow, and they were all members of that organization.
Well, yeah. I don't know that they all came to it. You know, we met in various homes after we got started. Mm-hmm. I know we met here a lot, and we met in other houses. We met in the Harrises. Now, Ed Harris, who owned Troy Laundry, he went out of business because people would not patronize his laundry.
Wow.
And they moved away eventually. You know, he lived where Dr. Peterson does now, Dr. and Miss Peterson, in that house. Yeah, there was very, very strong feelings. As if, you know, these black people came off of the moon or something.
Well, and I mean, I know that you have had a long history in Georgetown, and you went to school in Georgetown at Southwestern.
Yeah.
Right?
Uh-huh. So I graduated from here in 49.
Yeah, and then you moved away and came back in 1960. Mm-hmm. So did it surprise you that the community was so anti-integration?
I don't think we ever thought about it, you know, until that time. Although, of course, we knew Southwestern wasn't really integrated at the time we were students. Mm-hmm. So it just, you know, wouldn't have come up until we got to be parents and were concerned with the finances of the school. And We had some good teachers in our schools, but they weren't all.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them were, I'm sure, very prejudiced against the black kids. You know, they...
Well, I know that you are talking a lot about financial issues, and that was sort of the heart of the state lawsuit. Is that right?
Yeah, and you know, the taxes were not very high here. Property taxes and people that lived in the outline, you know, in the whole school district, and nobody wanted them to go up. You know, that's what some of these segregationists, you know, they were elected on that platform. So, I mean, nobody ever wants taxes to go up.
Right, and this would have raised the taxes.
Well, yes, and you look at the Georgetown schools now, all the wonderful things they've done, you know, like this Community for Fine Arts and all these things. It's just a different place.
Mm-hmm. So, but was there ever like a moral initiative behind why you were involved?
Yeah, I think so. We felt it was definitely a question of morality. You know, it was immoral to be like that, but we didn't. Obviously, we're not going to go around and talk like that because we had friends, lots of friends and acquaintances who didn't agree with us.
Mm-hmm.
But
would you say like most of your friends and acquaintances didn't agree with you?
well, you know, the people through Southwestern, they were pretty liberal-minded. I think all of them, really. And this young woman that Billy, whatever her last name was, whose husband taught in the Georgetown schools, she really agreed with me, I think, pretty much. And Carver was in terrible shape. They couldn't afford to build a decent school for the blacks. Mm-hmm. Had little bitty rooms.
But eventually they did build a school, right?
No.
They never did?
No, we stopped. That's what our suit did. We brought an injunction that they couldn't buy land and they couldn't start a building program until that was over. Okay. And we lost, here, and then we went to district court. That's when I testified.
Oh, you testified?
Oh, I testified, yes. Oh,
wow.
yes. Because, I was the secretary. And the judge couldn't have been nicer. He asked me just a few questions. And among other things, he asked me, why we got involved. And I said the same thing. But he said, did I think that we would integrate it without a court order? And I said, oh, no. It couldn't have happened. Yeah.
Right. And so what kind of other things did that judge ask you? Do you remember?
That was about it.
Yeah.
He asked, he had a list of the members and all these people, but he did ask me a whole lot.
Mm-hmm. And what about this argument that some of the GISD board members had about free transfer? What did you think about that?
I don't think that really existed for black students.
Mm-hmm.
Where would they go? They didn't have any money. Their parents were, at best cooks and whatnot,
So they couldn't really afford to get over to the white schools, even if they were allowed to go.
Well, they could come to these in Georgetown.
Mm-hmm.
And we had school buses, that bused the kids if they were too far away.
Mm-hmm.
So that wouldn't have been the problem. Our kids could walk to school because